Welcome to one of the most shocking and disturbing stories ever found in the history of Charleston, South Carolina. Before we get started, I want you to drop in the comments where you're watching from and what exact time it is where you are. We really want to know which places and what times of day or night people are tuning in to hear stories like this. Hidden behind the pretty stone streets and grand houses of old-timey Charleston is a story that almost nobody dares to talk about. In the year 1839, when this busy port city was booming with trade and the dark horror of slavery, a merchant named Elias Thornwood had made himself look like a totally normal, respectable businessman. The Thornwood home sat on Trade Street, a tall three-story brick house with white columns and fancy balconies that basically screamed new money. By all accounts, Elias was doing great. He imported fancy European stuff like porcelain, silks, and furniture for Charleston's rich people. His warehouse near the Cooper River had 15 workers and was bringing in serious cash for the family. What makes this story stand out from tons of other old history stories is one weird little note found in 1868, tucked into the margin of a church register at St. Philip's Episcopal Church. It said, "Thornwood wife not deceased as recorded, inquiries to cease by order of Judge Harrington." That one tiny line, discovered during a regular archive check in 1966, would blow open a cover-up that Charleston society had been hiding for almost 100 years. According to the official city records, Adelaide Thornwood, born Adelaide Montgomery in Boston, Massachusetts, died of yellow fever on September 2, 1839. Her burial spot in the churchyard at St. Philip's has a small headstone worn down by time and salty sea air. It simply reads, Adelaide Thornwood, beloved wife, 1817 to 1839. The death certificate, signed by a Dr. James Wilkinson, said yellow fever, which was common enough in the swampy land around Charleston that nobody would bat an eye. Here's the thing though, there were zero records of a yellow fever outbreak in Charleston during that time. In fact, city health records say it was an unusually healthy season, with cool breezes from the ocean keeping mosquitoes away. This little mismatch sat unnoticed for over a century until a grad student named Margaret Hollings, who was studying disease patterns in old South Carolina, caught it while going through burial records and health documents side by side. The Thornwood marriage had started 5 years before, when Elias, then 32 years old, traveled to Boston for business. He met Adelaide Montgomery, who was 22, at a fancy party hosted by her dad, a big-shot shipbuilder with connections all over New England. The relationship moved fast, and they had a winter wedding that basically joined northern business with southern trade. People who knew Adelaide described her as educated and full of life. She had gone to a finishing school in Philadelphia where she got into literature and science. Letters between Adelaide and her childhood friend Elizabeth Peabody show a woman with really forward-thinking ideas, and most dangerously for her new home in the South, some serious doubts about slavery. She wrote in 1837, "The practice I now witness daily seems a stain upon the soul of this nation, though I dare not express such thoughts beyond this correspondence." The young bride came to Charleston and was met by a society that looked at her with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Northern wives weren't super unusual among merchant families, but Adelaide's manners and education made her stand out in ways that created quiet friction. House staff remembered her as kind but a little distant, polite, but never quite as warm and familiar as Southern ladies of the time usually were with the people who worked in their homes. According to the later testimony of a house servant named Millicent, given to the Freedman's Bureau in 1866, Adelaide used to secretly teach the cook's young daughter to read, even though South Carolina law strictly forbade teaching enslaved people to be literate. That detail, mentioned almost as an aside in a deposition about something totally different, gives you a peek into just how tense things must have been inside the Thornwood house. By 1838, cracks in the marriage were starting to show to anyone paying attention in Charleston society. Elias and Adelaide were showing up together less and less at social events, and when they did, people noticed stiff conversations that would go dead whenever someone else walked up. Mary Pinckney, wife of a lawyer named George Pinckney and known in her private letters as someone who noticed everything, wrote to her sister in Virginia, "The Thornwood situation grows curious. He speaks for her at every turn, and she appears increasingly like a bird in a gilded cage, present, but not permitted to sing." The Pinckney letters were found in a trunk in Alabama in 1958 and give us one of the only real eyewitness accounts of the Thornwood marriage from inside their social circle. Mary Pinckney also noticed that Adelaide had gotten really pale and thin, which started rumors of tuberculosis, though Adelaide denied being sick whenever anyone asked. What turned this story from a sad marriage into something truly horrifying was discovered in 1865 after Union soldiers took over Charleston. A Captain Frederick Bellows, who was going through property records as part of post-war reconstruction work, found a bill of sale dated August 27, 1839, 6 days before Adelaide's supposed death. The document, buried inside a bunch of normal business paperwork, recorded the sale of one mulatto woman, approximately 20 years of age, to a slave trader named James Bouvier, who had connections in New Orleans and the Caribbean. The price was $1,800, way above normal market rate for a house servant. What really caught Captain Bellows's eye wasn't the sale itself, sadly, those were everywhere, but the physical description attached to it. It said, fair complexion with appearance of sunburn across nose and cheeks, literate, speaks well, claims Boston origin. And it was signed with Elias Thornwood's handwriting. That strange description made Bellows dig deeper. Going through shipping records from Charleston Harbor, he found that a merchant ship called the Carolina Maid had left for New Orleans on August 29, 1839, with James Bouvier listed as a passenger, and the cargo included household goods and one servant. The most damning piece was a letter Bellows found in the confiscated files of Judge Harrington, the same judge named in that church margin note, dated October 12, 1839. It came from one of Elias Thornwood's business contacts in New Orleans. It said, "The matter has been concluded to your specifications. The package has been delivered to the Spanish gentleman as arranged. Your instructions regarding communication have been followed precisely. No further correspondence on this matter should be necessary." It was signed simply J.B., James Bouvier's initials. Captain Bellows's investigation got pushed aside when more urgent reconstruction stuff needed his attention, but he filed a report suggesting Adelaide Thornwood had not died of yellow fever at all. She had been sold into slavery, possibly shipped outside U.S. territory so nobody could ever find her or get her back. That report sat buried in military files until a historian named Dr. Gerald McKinney found it while researching a book about Charleston's Reconstruction era in 1963. Even then, the whole thing seemed so unbelievable that McKinney initially brushed it off as a Union soldier misreading old Southern paperwork. It wasn't until he connected it with Margaret Hollings's disease research and that tiny church margin note that the horrifying picture started to come together. The silence around Adelaide's fate went beyond just official records. House servants who might have seen what happened in the weeks before her disappearance were all scattered after her supposed death. Elias Thornwood sold the Charleston house in 1840 and moved to Savannah, Georgia, where he got remarried and started a new import business. He died in 1852 of heart failure, his secret apparently safe and sound. What makes this case extra disturbing isn't just the act itself, though the idea of a husband selling his wife into slavery is about as low as a person can go. Even in a time when slavery was legal, it's the whole community cover-up that had to happen for it to work. Dr. Wilkinson, who signed the fake death certificate, kept practicing medicine in Charleston until 1858. Judge Harrington, who apparently told people to stop asking questions, stayed on the Charleston court until 1871. These were not shady outsiders, they were respected professionals who chose to be part of hiding what can only be described as murder by another name. The big question researchers keep coming back to is, why was Adelaide Thornwood targeted for such a horrible fate? Little pieces of evidence actually point to an answer that's both ordinary and chilling. In April 1839, Elias took a huge hit when a shipment of French goods sank off the North Carolina coast and insurance only covered part of the loss. At the same time, property records show Adelaide had just inherited a big chunk of money from her grandfather's estate in Massachusetts. Under the law at the time, a husband had complete legal control over his wife's money and inheritance. A letter from Elias to his Boston lawyer dated May 1839 asks about how to get around obstacles blocking access to the Montgomery family trust funds and complains about delays caused by family interference. Adelaide's brother William Montgomery apparently came to Charleston in July of that year, though nobody wrote down what happened during his visit. He was back in Boston by early August. His signature shows up on a business document there dated August 12th. What gives this whole story its most disturbing layer is something discovered in 1965 by construction workers renovating the old Thornwood house on Trade Street. Behind a sealed section of wall in the cellar, they found a small leather-bound book. Water had wrecked most of the pages, but the ones that could still be read appeared to be Adelaide's private diary. The entries stop dead in mid-August 1839. The last readable passage says, "E has become something I no longer recognize." The rage in his eyes when denied cannot be described. He speaks of debts and obligations, then in the same breath of opportunities in the islands. "I have written to William, but fear the letter may not have been sent. Last night the key was removed from my door. Mary P. has promised to call tomorrow, which provides some comfort." The diary was handed over to the Charleston Historical Society, where it basically sat forgotten in storage until Dr. McKinney's research brought the whole case back into the spotlight. Mary Pinckney's promised visit apparently never happened, or if it did, it didn't save Adelaide. Her letters from September 1839 mention being shocked at Adelaide's sudden death and sending flowers to the funeral, which she didn't attend because she said she was suddenly not feeling well. By October, her letters don't mention Adelaide or the Thornwoods at all, which is pretty suspicious given how closely she'd been watching them before. When Dr. McKinney reopened the Thornwood case in 1965, there were no living relatives of the main people involved left to talk to. The Thornwood family line had ended with Elia's son from his second marriage, who died without any kids in 1921. The Montgomery family from Boston had moved west in the early 1900s, their connection to Adelaide having been cut long before. What happened to Adelaide Thornwood after she was sold remains a mystery. Slave records from New Orleans show no entry that matches her description, which suggests James Bouvier followed through on the plan to ship her out of U.S. territory, probably to Cuba or somewhere in the Caribbean, where her light skin and education would have made her useful as a house servant or personal companion rather than a field worker. The mention of a Spanish gentleman in the letter Captain Bellows found suggests there was already a buyer lined up, someone who would value her education and refinement. The thought of Adelaide, raised free and privileged in Boston, educated and connected to some of the most respected people in New England, living out her days as a slave with her whole identity erased, is a particular kind of American horror. That her own husband could arrange this with the help of respected community leaders shows just how deeply rotten the institution of slavery had made things, even among people considered the pillars of society. In 1968, a small ceremony was held at St. Philip's Churchyard. The worn headstone claiming to mark Adelaide Thornwood's final resting place got a small bronze plaque added to it. It simply reads, "Adelaide Montgomery Thornwood, 1817 to unknown. Let truth prevail." The grave itself was dug up during the renewed investigation, and inside they found only a few personal items, a hairbrush, a pair of gloves, some books, but no human remains. These objects, carefully preserved and sealed in a wooden box, now sit in the collection of the Charleston Historical Society, quiet witnesses to a crime that history almost completely forgot. People who visit the archive sometimes say they feel a heavy, uncomfortable feeling in the storage room where the box is kept, though that might just be the totally natural human response to coming face to face with such calculated cruelty from our shared past. Adelaide Thornwood's story is about more than just one evil act. It shows how systems of oppression don't just corrupt the people directly involved, they corrupt everyone around them too. The doctors who sign false paperwork, the judges who tell people to stop asking questions, the friends who choose not to push for answers. In a society built on human bondage, even a woman of privilege could be turned into property the moment certain protections were taken away from her. The thin line between being free and being enslaved turned out to be a lot easier to cross than comfortable history books would like to admit. You can't help but wonder how many other cases like this are still sitting undiscovered in archives all across the country, their victims lost not just to freedom but to memory itself. Today, the Thornwood House still stands on Trade Street, having passed through many owners since 1840. The current residents say nothing unusual happens there, maybe because Adelaide's spirit was never really there at all, but was carried far away from Charleston to suffer an unknown fate somewhere else. The warehouse near the Cooper River was torn down in 1932 to make room for newer buildings. Judge Harrington's courthouse still serves the city today, though almost nobody who walks through it knows the role it played in letting such a massive injustice happen. St. Philip's Church is still an active Episcopal parish, its cemetery a popular stop on Charleston History Tour, though guides rarely bring up the story of the empty grave with its quiet accusation written in bronze. Maybe the most disturbing part of Adelaide Thornwood's story is just how easily it was erased, how completely the cover-up worked for over a century. If it hadn't been for that one accidental margin note in a church register, the mismatch in disease records, and Captain Bellows's forgotten report, her real story might never have come out at all. This case is a reminder that history isn't just what actually happened, it's what got written down and what got deliberately left out. It makes you wonder how many other truths are still buried, not under cemetery dirt, but under layers of destroyed documents, misdirection, and people collectively agreeing to look the other way. In the years since Dr. McKinney's research brought the case into the spotlight, several people have tried to trace Adelaide's path after she left Charleston Harbor. Researchers have gone through port records in New Orleans, Havana, and Santo Domingo, looking for any sign of a woman matching her description arriving in September 1839. A few interesting clues have popped up. A notation in the household accounts of a Spanish merchant in Havana mentions hiring a new English-speaking house manager in October of that year. A letter from a French plantation owner near Port-au-Prince to his brother in Paris mentions buying a remarkably educated mulatto woman who claims American birth from a Spanish dealer in late 1839. But no solid proof has been found to confirm where Adelaide ultimately ended up or what happened to her. Like so many victims of human trafficking throughout history, she disappeared into a system that was specifically designed to erase individual identities and turn people into interchangeable goods. For people who know where to look, echoes of Adelaide Thornwood's story can still be found all over Charleston. The fake story of her death from yellow fever shows up in several 19th century family history records of prominent Charleston families, repeated without question for generations. Her name is even listed among yellow fever victims on a small plaque at the Charleston Museum, which is a deeply ironic memorial to a woman who didn't die, but was instead sentenced to a living death far from home. The sealed wall section in the cellar where her diary was found has been preserved by the current owners of the Trade Street house as a somber reminder, though most visitors have no idea what it really means. Maybe most heartbreaking of all, records at Boston's Mount Auburn Cemetery show that Adelaide's mother, Sarah Montgomery, had a memorial stone put there in 1845, inscribed in memory of Adelaide, lost to us but not forgotten. Whether Sarah Montgomery ever found out the truth about what happened to her daughter is something nobody knows. As modern-day Charleston keeps wrestling with its complicated history and the huge role slavery played in building its wealth and shaping its society, stories like Adelaide's challenge the easy, comfortable versions of the past. She exists in this strange in-between space, a free woman condemned to slavery through a complete betrayal of both the law and personal trust. Her story is a reminder that the moral rot of slavery didn't just live on plantations and at auction blocks. It seeped into marriages, friendships, and the very institutions that were supposed to deliver justice and truth. The fact that someone of Adelaide's background and connections could be made to disappear like this raises seriously uncomfortable questions about how many others, people with fewer protections and resources, might have gone through the same thing without leaving even the small scraps of evidence that let us piece her story together. In 1969, Dr. McKinney published his full account of the case in the Journal of Southern History, bringing serious academic attention to this unusual situation of a free woman being sold into slavery by her husband. The article got a brief burst of attention, a mention in the New York Times and a few regional papers, but public interest faded quickly, maybe because the story didn't fit neatly into any comfortable category. It wasn't a ghost story with spooky elements. It wasn't a murder mystery with a clean ending. Instead, it was something maybe more disturbing, a true crime with no justice, a disappearance with no resolution, and a cover-up successful enough to almost completely erase a woman from history. For people who study the darker chapters of American history, Adelaide Thornwood's story is a reminder of just how fragile freedom could be, even for people who seemed completely secure in their place in society. It shows the enormous power that systems of oppression hand to people who are positioned to abuse them, and how institutions meant to protect people can be twisted to serve selfish interests instead. Most of all, it stands as a tribute to the countless untold stories buried beneath the pretty cobblestones and grand facades of cities built on hidden suffering. Adelaide Montgomery Thornwood entered the historical record twice, first through the fake story of her death, and later through the scattered evidence of what actually happened to her. Between those two entries is a blank space that can never be fully filled, a life interrupted and then erased by people who valued money over human beings. Today, tourists stroll through Charleston's historic district admiring the gorgeous old buildings and beautiful gardens, with almost no idea they're walking through the scene of such an intimate betrayal. The Thornwood House doesn't appear on any ghost tour or lists of notorious locations. It's been completely renovated, its dark history known only to serious history researchers. The only visible reminder of Adelaide's story is that small bronze plaque in St. Philip's churchyard. Let truth prevail. A quiet challenge to a cover-up that almost completely succeeded in wiping her from the historical record. For those who know where to look, it's a sobering reminder that underneath the fancy manners and romantic stories of old Charleston lies a history far more complex and brutal than guided tours usually bother to mention. The weight of Adelaide's absence keeps making itself felt in small ways throughout Charleston's historical landscape. During preservation work in the 1970s, architects restoring homes on Trade Street reported something weird at the old Thornwood house. Workers refused to stay alone in the cellar where the diary had been found, describing a heavy, suffocating feeling and sudden drops in temperature. Skeptics say this was just the power of suggestion after workers heard the house's history, but the discomfort apparently happened even among people who hadn't been told the story at all. The current owners who bought the property in 2004 say they haven't experienced anything unusual, though they admit to feeling a certain heaviness in the space where the hidden diary was found. In 1972, a collection of letters turned up during renovation of an old shipping office near Charleston Harbor. Among them was correspondence between Elias Thornwood and various business contacts from 1838 to 1839. Most were normal trade stuff, but several had veiled references to the Boston situation and domestic arrangements requiring adjustment. The most revealing was a letter dated July 23, 1839, in which Thornwood wrote to James Bouvier, "The legal entanglements regarding the northern property prove more stubborn than anticipated. Family interference has complicated access to necessary funds. Alternative arrangements may provide a more expedient solution to both matters simultaneously." The careful, coded language strongly suggests Elias had been planning Adelaide's disappearance for weeks, probably pushed over the edge by her family's efforts to protect her inheritance from him. Adelaide's brother William appears to have had a bad feeling about something during his visit to Charleston in July 1839. After he got back to Boston, he went to the family attorney about options for legally protecting his sister's inheritance from her husband. A letter from the attorney dated August 18 talks about setting up a separate trust to keep Adelaide's money safe, and also mentions William's concerns about his sister being increasingly isolated and having her mail restricted. William was apparently planning to come back to Charleston in September, a trip made pointless when news arrived of Adelaide's supposed death from yellow fever. His personal diary, preserved by Montgomery descendants and found by a genealogist in 1977, has one cryptic entry from October 1839, a situation more troubling than initially feared. Charleston authorities dismissive, Judge H particularly unhelpful, must pursue other channels. There's no record of what William did after that, no public accusations, no legal proceedings against Elias Thornwood in Boston newspapers. The willingness of Charleston's professional class to cover up Adelaide's fate tells you a lot about how things worked back then. Dr. James Wilkinson, who faked her death certificate, wasn't just a doctor, he also sat on the board of directors of the Charleston Mercantile Bank, where Elias Thornwood did his banking. Judge Harrington, who ordered people to stop asking questions, had major investments in shipping businesses that used Thornwood's import connections. These weren't random bureaucrats, these were men whose financial lives were tied to keeping Elias Thornwood's reputation clean. Their willingness to participate in essentially erasing a woman from existence and sending her to an unimaginable fate shows just how completely the institution of slavery had corrupted moral thinking, even among so-called respectable people. Maybe the most haunting piece of evidence in this whole investigation is a document found in 1979 in the archives of a New Orleans notary office. Among property transaction papers was a bill of sale dated October 12, 1839, recording the transfer of one female domestic servant, fair complexion, approximately 25 years of age, from a Spanish merchant named Carlos Vega to a French planter with holdings outside Port-au-Prince. The woman is listed only as Alina, but a side note describes her as educated, suitable for household management, English-speaking with some French. The timing and description line up with everything we know about Adelaide's sale and transport. If this was Adelaide Thornwood, renamed and sold again, her path had led to St. Domingue, where she would have found herself in a French-speaking society with nothing familiar around her. The price paid $2,400 was a significant jump from her original sale price in Charleston, suggesting that her education and refinement were considered valuable selling points in the Caribbean slave market. The trail goes cold after that transaction. No further records have been found that might tell us what happened to Adelaide next. Did she live out her days on a French plantation in Haiti, maybe eventually carving out a little bit of independence thanks to her skills? Did she try to escape, maybe heading for a British colony where slavery had already been abolished in 1833? Did she get sick and die far from home in a land completely foreign to her? These questions have no answers, though researchers keep combing through Caribbean archives looking for any trace of a woman matching her description. The very completeness of her disappearance underscores just how terrifyingly efficient the slave system was at wiping out individual identities and cutting every tie to a person's previous life. In 1983, a strange footnote to the case appeared when restoration work at St. Philip's Church uncovered a hidden space beneath the floor near the altar. Inside was a small tin box containing personal items, a cameo brooch, a pair of reading glasses, several letters from Adelaide's mother in Boston, and a tiny painted portrait of a young woman with auburn hair. A note with these things, written in shaky handwriting on church stationery, said, "These belong to Mrs. T. They should not have been buried with empty coffin as husband directed. I keep them safe until truth may be told. Thomas Jennings, sexton." Church records confirmed that Thomas Jennings had worked as the church's sexton from 1829 until his death in 1857. This discovery suggests that at least one person with direct knowledge of the whole deception had kept his doubts to himself all those years, carefully preserving these little pieces of Adelaide's life, waiting for a day when her true story might be able to come out. The items were catalogued and added to the Adelaide Thornwood collection at the Charleston Historical Society. The portrait in particular gives us a real human connection to a woman we previously only knew through written descriptions. The face looking back at us shows a young woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a composed expression, her hair styled in the fashion of the 1830s, with a small smile that suggests a quiet, reserved kind of hope about life. The fact that this image survived when so much else was deliberately destroyed feels like a small victory against the people who tried to erase her completely. Visitors to the Historical Society can now look at Adelaide Montgomery Thornwood's face and think about the extraordinary cruelty that could turn a free woman of good family into human property, trafficked across borders on her own husband's orders. Historians have debated whether Adelaide's case was one of a kind, or just an unusually well-documented example of something that happened more than we know. Records from the antebellum period suggest that while selling a free person into slavery wasn't common, it wasn't completely unheard of either. Most documented cases involved free black people who were kidnapped or tricked into enslavement, crimes made easy by a system that assumed black Americans were enslaved unless they could prove otherwise. Adelaide's case is unusual because she was white, educated, and connected to prominent Northern families, advantages that should have protected her, but ultimately didn't. The fact that her husband could arrange her enslavement with the help of Charleston's professional class shows the absolute power that slave-holding societies gave to white men over everyone legally beneath them, including, in many ways, their own wives. The legal situation of women in antebellum America made Adelaide especially vulnerable to what her husband chose to do. Under a legal principle called coverture, a married woman's legal identity was basically absorbed into her husband's. She couldn't own property separately, sign contracts, or file lawsuits on her own. Her inheritance legally became her husband's the moment they married. While social customs and family connections gave women some practical protection, a woman who had been cut off from her family and friends, as Adelaide increasingly had been in the months before she disappeared, had almost no formal way to fight back against a husband who wanted to control her. That Elias Thornwood pushed that control to its absolute extreme by literally selling his wife reflects not just one man's depravity, but the logical end result of a legal system that treated women as subordinate and human beings as potential property. Another layer to Adelaide's vulnerability came out in 1986, when a genealogist researching the Montgomery family discovered that Adelaide's maternal grandmother had been French Creole from Louisiana. While this ancestry was apparently distant enough that Adelaide was fully accepted as white in Boston society, it gave Elias a technical opening to classify her as having mixed ancestry, a mulatto in the cruel racial language of the time, in the bill of sale. In a society obsessed with racial categories and the enforcement of the slave system, even a whisper of non-white ancestry could put a person in serious danger. Whether Elias actually believed this lineage mattered, or was just using it as a legal loophole to make the sale work isn't clear, but it shows how racial ideology could be weaponized even against people normally protected by white privilege, when other factors like gender and marital status made them vulnerable. The complicity of Charleston society in keeping Adelaide's fate secret goes even beyond the direct participants. Mary Pinckney's sudden stop in writing about the Thornwoods suggests she may have learned something about the truth but chose not to pursue it. Church records show Adelaide's funeral service was barely attended. Most of Elias Thornwood's business associates sent their wives rather than showing up themselves, as if they didn't want to directly participate in the lie. Newspaper accounts of her death were short and generic, nothing like the extended obituaries usually given to women of her social standing. These small oddities, each one unremarkable on its own, form a clear pattern of discomfort and avoidance when you look at them all together. Charleston society, it seems, sensed something was wrong with the Thornwood situation, but collectively chose to look away, a community-wide silence that protected Elias and abandoned Adelaide to her fate. In 1990, historian Dr. Rebecca Harrington, no relation to the judge, published a deep analysis of the Thornwood case, placing it in the broader context of how vulnerable women were in antebellum society. She argued that while what happened to Adelaide was extreme, the legal and social structures that made it possible affected all women to some degree. The total control handed to husbands over their wives' property, movement, and legal standing created conditions where abuse could thrive behind closed doors. She wrote that while the specific form of Adelaide's abuse was shaped by the slavery that defined her time and place, the basic dynamics of power and control have shown up in different ways across all of history. Dr. Harrington's analysis helped shift how people understood the case, from a strange one-off historical curiosity to a revealing window into how systems of oppression based on gender, race, and money all worked together. The physical places connected to Adelaide's story have changed a lot in the nearly 2 centuries since her disappearance. The Thornwood house on Trade Street is now a private home, its elegant exterior giving no clue about what happened there. The warehouse near the Cooper River, where Elias ran his import business, was knocked down in the 1930s to make room for newer buildings. The offices of Dr. Wilkinson and Judge Harrington have been repurposed countless times. They currently house a restaurant and a law firm. St. Philip's Church is still an active parish, though the empty grave with its accusatory bronze plaque stands as a quiet rebuke to the institution's past role in the cover-up. These physical changes mirror how history itself tries to move beyond past moral failures, sometimes through genuine reckoning, sometimes through convenient forgetting. In 2007, one final piece of the Adelaide Thornwood puzzle turned up during the digitization of archives from a Havana trading company. Among thousands of routine business documents was a letter dated November 1839, from Carlos Vega, the Spanish merchant identified in the New Orleans sale record, to a business associate. The letter was mostly about tobacco shipments, but a postscript said, "The American woman continues to insist upon her free status and Boston origins. She grows troublesome despite correction. If current sale to French islands falls through, may need to place her further from American territories, perhaps Santo Domingo interior or even Brazil. Will advise." This short, chilling note is the last known mention of a woman who may have been Adelaide. Its totally matter-of-fact tone about correction and the possibility of selling her even further away offers a glimpse at the horror she was living through, a free woman insisting on her own true identity, being punished for it, and being treated as an object to be repositioned wherever it was most convenient. Whether Adelaide Thornwood ever found any measure of justice or freedom is unknown. If the woman in Carlos Vega's letter was Adelaide, she apparently hadn't given up, still insisting on who she really was despite everything being done to break her. That small resistance against a system trying to erase her completely is something. The reference to a possible sale to the French islands lines up with the bill of sale found in New Orleans records, suggesting she may indeed have ended up in Haiti. French colonists there kept slavery going even after the Haitian Revolution had officially abolished it in much of the territory, creating isolated pockets where human bondage continued. If Adelaide was sold to such a plantation, her situation would have been incredibly dangerous. Slave and free territories existed side by side in uneasy tension, with the constant threat of uprisings and shifting rules. In the bigger picture of American history, Adelaide Thornwood disappeared at a really pivotal moment. The year 1839 saw growing tension between abolitionists and slavery defenders. The famous Amistad case, where enslaved Africans seized control of the ship transporting them and ended up in the United States, started that same year. Northern opposition to slavery was getting more organized and louder, while Southern states increasingly felt they were under attack. Adelaide, with her Boston background and her private doubts about slavery, embodied this national divide right inside her own home. The fact that her husband could silence her so completely, not just shut her up figuratively, but literally remove her from society and erase her identity, reflects in miniature the efforts of pro-slavery interests to control the national conversation and shut down anyone who pushed back. Modern Charleston has started to be more honest about its complicated past, including the central role of slavery in building the city's wealth. Historical markers now acknowledge slave markets and auction houses that used to be deliberately left off the tourist map. Museums now include exhibits on the lives of enslaved people alongside those of the city's elite. In this broader context of historical honesty, Adelaide Thornwood's story has taken on new importance as an example of how the institution of slavery corrupted even the most intimate human relationships. A small exhibit at the Charleston Museum now includes her story, featuring copies of the key documents and the miniature portrait. The exhibit notes that while her case was unusual in some ways, the systems of power that made it possible affected countless others whose stories are still untold. Visitors to Charleston today might walk right past the Thornwood House on Trade Street without realizing its significance, or pause at Adelaide's empty grave at St. Philip's without fully grasping the horror it represents. But for those who know the story, these places carry a weight that's hard to shake. They become monuments not just to one woman's suffering, but to the massive moral catastrophe of a society that could justify human bondage and the treatment of people as things to be bought and sold. The bronze plaque with its simple demand, "Let truth prevail," speaks not just to Adelaide's specific case, but to the ongoing fight to look history honestly in the face, even when what we see is deeply uncomfortable. The partial recovery of Adelaide Thornwood's story from historical erasure represents both a success and a failure of historical memory. On one hand, the discovery of key documents and physical evidence has allowed us to piece together the broad outline of what happened and push back against the fake story of her yellow fever death. On the other hand, the most important questions are still completely unanswered. What happened to Adelaide after her sale to the French planter? Did she live a long life or a short one? Did she ever get any measure of freedom back? Did she hold on to hope of being found by her Boston family? These questions will probably stay unanswered unless more documents somehow turn up from Haiti or other Caribbean places she might have been taken. Without those answers, Adelaide's story stands as a haunting reminder of how completely a human life could be erased by systems of power and oppression. A woman with education, social standing, family connections, and money could still be reduced to property through the combination of being a woman and living in a slave society. Her identity could be officially wiped out through fake documents and community silence. Her entire fate could be decided by her husband's financial needs and his business partner's greed. This total vulnerability, having no real rights or recourse, was the daily reality for millions of enslaved people throughout American history. Adelaide's case is remarkable not because her suffering was unique, but because her original social position makes the machinery of her erasure more visible and more documented than it usually was. As night falls over Charleston, the streets of the historic district get quiet. The grand old houses with their porches and gardens take on a different feel in the darkness, still beautiful, but with shadows that seem deeper, more hiding. In those shadows, you might imagine Adelaide Thornwood on that August night in 1839, maybe realizing too late what her husband had arranged for her. Did she have a moment of horrible clarity as they took her from the house? Did she understand that the death certificate was already prepared and the fake story already set up? Did she hold on to hope that her brother William or her friend Mary Pinckney would see through the lie and come looking for her? History gives us no answers to those questions. What remains instead is the silence that almost succeeded in erasing her completely, a silence broken only by scattered fragments of evidence that survived by accident and the slow passage of time. For modern visitors to Charleston, walking the same streets Adelaide once walked, her story gives a sobering reality check to the romantic, prettied-up version of antebellum life. Behind the gracious facades and beneath the cobblestones lies a history far more complex and far more brutal than most guided tour bother to acknowledge. The fact that a woman could be sold into slavery by her own husband in 1839 America, with the help of community leaders and the silence of social peers, is a reminder of how completely moral reasoning can be broken by systems that deny the full humanity of any group of people. Bronze plaque in St. Philip's churchyard, "Let Truth Prevail," stands as both a memorial and a warning, a quiet insistence that we face history honestly, even when what it tells us is deeply disturbing. Adelaide Montgomery Thornwood was born into privilege in Boston in 1817 and vanished from the historical record in the late summer of 1839. The conspiracy to erase her worked for over a century before pieces of evidence allowed her true story to start coming out. Though many questions about her fate remain unanswered, the partial recovery of her story is a powerful reminder of how historical silences so often hide the experiences of those most vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. In breaking this particular silence, we honor not just Adelaide but the countless others whose stories are still untold, whose suffering was carefully hidden by those who benefited from systems of oppression, and whose humanity was denied by laws designed to protect property rather than people. The empty grave in St. Philip's churchyard may contain no human remains, but it has become a place for a different kind of memory. A place where truth, however incomplete and however delayed, has finally managed to prevail over deliberate forgetting.